Today's daf, Be'ez Hashem, is Masech Zevachim Daf Tez Zayin, number 16, and we're going to start from the new parak Kol HaZvachim, which is on Daf Tez Vav Amud Beis. It says the Mishnah. We're discussing over here the mitzvah of Kabbalah. Kabbalah is this mitzvah when after they slaughter the sheep, the korban, there's a mitzvah on the kohen to catch the blood. Says the Mishnah. Mishnah begins the parak. Kol hazvachim, all karbanos shekiblu damim that was caught. The blood was caught by a zar, a non-kohen. Oinin, somebody who's an aval. An oinin is somebody who lost one of the seven relatives, and it's that day, and the nighttime. So that is an oinin. Tful yoim is somebody who went to the mikvah but did not have the sun set on him. Mechusa kippurim. Mechusa kippurim is a kohen gadol that is a kohen that was a zav, a matzayra, that went to the mikvah and he did the sunset, but he's a person, a type of tuma that had to bring a korban. Or somebody, if it's a kohen gadol, he's missing one of the eight pieces of clothing, or a regular kohen that's missing one of the four pieces of clothing that he's supposed to do the service with. Or you have a kohen shaloi rochatz yadayim raglayim that did not do the appropriate washing of the hands and feet from the kior, or he didn't get to go have a bris milah, a tamei, somebody who's tamei, yoshev, somebody who did the avoida, he was sitting down. He caught the blood, let's say, and any avoida he does sitting down. If he's standing on top of vessels or on top of an animal, in other words, his foot, or agabe raglech on the foot of his friend. In other words, his feet is not touching the ground because there's an interruption, a separation between his feet and the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. All these things puzzle the service is puzzle, and the korban is puzzle. Kibel b'smoil, but let's say you caught the blood with your left hand, puzzle, it's puzzle. Reb Shimon says left hand is okay. Says the Gemara, Zor Manolan, how do you know a non-kohen that caught the blood, puzzled the korban, the Tani Levi, because Levi said like this. We're going to have a number of sources. How do you know you need a kohen for the Kabbalah? Tani Levi, we learned Tani Levi, Daber al-Harim Balbonov, there's a pasuk that said, here's the pasuk. Daber al-Harim Balbonov, v'nozru mikotche b'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu, that they should be separated from doing kachim and don't disqualify the karbonos if they are tame, betumasai alav. Here it is, betumasai alav. So if they do it, then they have a tuma, then the kohen is disqualifies the carbon. But it says from the karbonos of Jewish people. So the Gemara says, why does it say Bnei Yisrael? Bnei Yisrael lemutemai. What does that exclude? If does that mean to exclude a carbon that was brought by a lady, that a kohen could do the service betuma? That's not true. But carbon nashim betuma karev, can a kohen service a carbon brought by a lady with tuma? Elumute goyim, it's coming to exclude goyim, that if a goy brought a carbon, the kohen is allowed to do the service of that carbon that was brought by a goy. He's allowed to do it betuma. Says the Gemara, hashta, that's not true. Hashta tzitz loy meratza, damamra, goyim loy nsheg bein mezel loy hurtza. You don't get a kapara if you did the service of a goyish carbon betuma. You don't get a kapara, as opposed to a Jew. If you did by accident the tum by accident you did it betuma, you do get a karbana, you do get a kapara from the fact that the kohen gadol wore it sits. But bottom line is betuma karev. Can you bring a carbon of a goy betuma? That doesn't make sense. So why does the Torah say bnei Yisrael, that the Jewish carbons have to be careful from tuma? This is what the pasuk means. You have to read it this way. This is separate from any carbon doing it betuma. Stop. Bnei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu. And only if a non-kohen should not do the service either, because if they do the service, they're going to disqualify the carbon. So you read it like as two different ideas. Number one, separate from Tuma. And you see the other idea is that a Zar, non-coin, should not disqualify the the carbon if it does the service. So that's one source, that a Zar is disqualified from doing the service. The Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, in the Bei Rabbi Shmuel, we learned, Yeshiva, they say, Asi b'kal v'choyim v'balmum. I could learn this idea from a kal v'choymer, from a balmum, somebody who's handicapped. Ma balmum, a coin that oichel, a coin that has a handicap. He's allowed to eat kachim. He's allowed to eat, let's say, the carbon. A coin who's is allowed to eat the carbon chatas, whatever. He's allowed to eat any type of kachim food. Im oven, but if he did the service, chilal, he disqualified the carbon because the pasuk says mumboy. If you have a blemish, v'lo yichalas migdashim. So you do get the you disqualify the carbon. So now we're going to say zar, a non-kohen, she'ein oichel, who's less of a problem. He cannot eat kachim. Ein certainly shem avad chilal, that if he did the service, he would disqualify the carbon. So we see that we learn out from a balmum that a zar would disqualify the service if he did it. So the Gemara says, Mala balmum, the reason why a balmum has a special stringency, and that's why it disqualifies a carbon. Shkein also by karv kemakriv, because this disqualification of a balmum, of a handicap, applies not only to the kohen, but also applies to the animal. As opposed to zaris, that only applies, if you want to say, to the person doing the service. But by an animal, there's no such a thing of a kohen animal or a Yisrael animal. So maybe if b'di'evet a zar did the service, it would not disqualify the carbon. And says the Gemara, Tamei Yechiach, then I'll prove it from Tamei, that if a Tamei disqualifies the service, and also there's no such a thing of a Tamei animal, so it's a disqualification of a service. And you learn a kal v'chomer from Tamei. Oh, but Ma'ala Tamei shekame Tamei, but you can't learn Balmum direct Azar from a Tamei because a Tamei has this ability to metama others. So it's a very type of chumradik, very strict type of disqualification, because a Tamei could make others people Tamei. A zar can't make somebody else a zar if it touches that person. So how would I know a zar would be disqualified service? So balmum yichich. Then I'll bring into the equation a balmum. A balmum, standing next to a balmum, you don't become a balmum. You're going to have a question of a balmum, shekain osaboy karv kamakriv, and you have a question on tamei. The chazar din, you just ignore that. Loyri gzek roizev, loyri gzek roizev. The chumrah that you find by balmum does not have by tamei, and the chumrah that you find by tamei does not have by balmum. So we see it's not the tumah that brings the chilul, but atzad shava shebehem shemuz harim, that they have a warning. The Torah says a tamei should not do the service, a balmum should not do the service, and then the Torah says vim avdu chilulu. If they did do the service, they disqualified. Af ani avizar. So I'm going to bring the question of azar. Shuhu muzer. The Torah says azar should not do the service. Vim avad chilul, and if he did do the service, he disqualified. So now we assume that a zar has a lav somewhere that he cannot do the service. So there's Gemara Manal and Musar. Which pasuk are you going to learn that the zar has a warning, as the Torah says, don't do the service? Imi v'nazru, if you have it from the pasuk of v'nazru, chilul begufa ksivbei, chilul begufa ksivbei. If you have it from v'nazru, chilul begufa ksivbei. It says by Nazru, if you're going to use this pasuk, then as the source that a Nazru, Bnei Yisrael, only a Jew should do the service, only a Kohen should do the service, not a Yisrael, right? Because that's how you'd read the pasuk. So then it already says v'lo yichal. They don't. So I don't need the kal v'chomer to tell me that you disqualify the service. Ella, there's another pasuk. Bizar lo yikrav aleichem. The Torah tells you that a zar should not be a makriv, non-kohen. But there the Torah doesn't say that if he does do it, the service is disqualified. That you learn from a Kal V'Chomer. Says the Gemara, Ikal Michrav, I could have a question on this Kal V'Chomer. So the Kal V'Chomer teaches you that if the Tsar did the service, it's disqualified. It disqualifies the carbon. The Tzad Shava of Balmum and Tame is not permitted on a private altar, but a non-coin was permitted on a private altar. I mean, that was the point of a private altar, which every person could have a private altar, and you find throughout Tanakh that all, like Nevi'im, were doing services on a private altar, although they were not Kahanim. So answers the Gemara, okay, throw out of the equation. Loi tema tami yechiach. Tami will be in the equation. Aleima oinin yechiach. So you learn it from Balmum, and oinin. That's what the oinin. Oinin is somebody, again, who lost a relative. If they do the service, they will disqualify the carbon. Mala oinin, but if you learn it directly from oinin, shekain osa b'maiser. An oinin has this stringency that it cannot eat maiser sheni. So therefore, it disqualifies kachim if it did the service. So then, balmum yechiach. Then you'll bring in balmum yechiach. A balmum is allowed to eat maiser sheni. Are you going to ask about a balmum? What's the question about mum? Shekain osa b'karav kamakriv. That's a problem even in the animal to be a balmum. So the chazadin, we see that it's not the chumrah that causes the disqualification of the service. The common denominator is that there's a disqualification over here, and that they have Torah tells you not to do it. The oinin and the tom and the balmum should not be doing the service, and if they do the service, they disqualify the carbon. So I'll bring also the same idea. Azar should not do the service. The Torah says don't do the service, and we're going to say also that we have a kal v'chomer to teach you that if a zar does the service, it's disqualified. The behemoth is disqualified. Says the Gemara, Hachanami lifrach, but I'm not going to ask you a question. Mala tzad shavish b'hem, oinen and balmum shekain lehutru babama. An oinen and balmum cannot perform on a bama. A oinen and a balmum cannot perform on a bama. A zar could perform on a bama. So the Gemara challenges that. Where does it say in the Chumash that an oinen is also on a private bama? Maybe it's permitted in a bama. So you can't ask this question. So again, according to this, you could learn it out from oinin and balmum. That's a source where a zar that does the service, a Yisrael that was makabel the blood, the whole carbon is disqualified. Rav Shasi has this other. He brings it from another kal v'chomer. Asya mi yoshiv. I will learn it from a kal v'chomer from somebody that sits. That a zar is aser that disqualifies the carbon, just like somebody who sits disqualifies the carbon. And the kal v'chomer will go this way. Ma yoshiv she'oichal. Someone who sits he could eat kachim food im avad, but if he did the service while he was sitting down chilul, he disqualified the carbon. Zar she'ena oichel, a non-kohen cannot eat kachim food, especially kachim, things belonging to the kahanim. Einidim sha'amav, certainly if he did that service chilul, he would disqualify the carbon. The Gemara says, Mali Yosef, she came postulated. Yosef sitting is a problem not just by doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash. You cannot even take testimony. Torah says you have to stand when you say testimony. So that's why it disqualifies a carbon. It's a type of flaw that applies elsewhere. Answers the Gemara, Miyushiv Talmud Chacham. Miyushiv Talmud Chacham. Not everybody has to stand when they say testimony. Chazal tell us that a Talmud Chacham is allowed to sit when he says testimony. So it's not an absolute din. But says the Gemara, Mal Hashem Yosef came possible edus. Maybe Hashem Yosef is a psul edus, is a psul edus. The fact is that Yisrael, normal people, are not allowed to sit when they say edus. So that's a psul edus, and the Gemara feels that is still a question because a zar could say edus. Someone who's non-Kohen, he could say edus. So, what's the problem? So, but a Yoshev cannot say Eidos, so you can't learn a direct Chal v'Chaima. So the Gemara says, Shem Yoshev Leipara. But the fact is, a Talmud Chacham could sit. But im tim parach, if you want to say that it's a good, if you want to say that it's a question, that the answer is Yoshev is a Shem Yoshev, that's a good question. That the fact is most people are not allowed to sit when they say Eidos, so therefore you can't learn Zaros directly from Yoshev. So Yoshev mechad v'hanach. I'll learn it from Yoshev and one of the others. Like you take Yoshev along with Tameh or Balmum or Einin. So that's what I will learn of it. So now, and then there's no more questions. So that will be a tzad shava to learn Zaros, that Zaros would disqualify a carbon. It's Yoshev and Einin. Now, that assumes that you can't ask the question that Yoshev is permitted, that's Asr Babana. See, Einin, Tameh, and Balmum is Asr Babama. But how do you know Yoshev is kosher b'bama? How do you know Yoshev is kosher b'bama menolan that you're not asking this question anymore? And says the Gemara, Amakra lamed lifnei Hashem l'sharsai lifnei Hashem v'loy lifnei baran. The mitzvah to stand doing the service only if you're doing it in the Beis Hamikdash, but not if you're doing it on a bama. So therefore, conclusion. Where do we have in the Chumash that says that a non-Kohen is also to do the service? And if he does the service, he is disqualifying the carbon. So the first answer is because you have it from the pasuk. V'nazru mikatche b'nei Yisrael. Here the Torah says mikatche b'nei Yisrael, right? So v'nazru mikatche, we divide it. We divide it by saying that they're not allowed to do it betuma, but b'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu. The part of Torah is telling you b'nei Yisrael v'lo yichalalu means that Jewish people that should not be a regular Yisrael should not do the service, and if he does the service, he disqualifies the carbon. Then we have another pasuk that just gives you the law, v'zor lo yikrav aleichem, that a non-Kohen is not allowed to do the service, but how do you know he disqualifies the carbon? That we learn from various Kal v'chaimers. Now the Mishnah said, Oinin, someone who lost one of the Zion Kroivim, so he's like an oval, let's say. How do you know if he does the service, he disqualifies the carbon? And says the Gemara, the pasuk says, "Min amigdash lo yetze v'lo yichala." Torah tells you that if a kohen gadol loses a relative, he should do the service when he's an oinin. Ha'acha, but it implies, but if a regular kohen is an oval, shelo yetza, that chilal, that if a kohen, a regular kohen that did not leave the Beis Hamikdash when he was anointed and did the service, chilal, he will disqualify the carbon. So here we see that only a kohen gadol has the exception of not disqualifying a carbon when he's an oinen, but a regular kohen that's an oinen and does the service, he disqualified the carbon. Says the Gemara, Rab Lezer, I have another pasuk. The Chumash tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was upset that the Seir Rosh Chodesh was burnt, and therefore Elazar and Isamar did not eat the Seir Rosh Chodesh on the day of the inauguration of the Mishkan. Why didn't they eat it? Because presumably their brother died that day, Nadav and Avihu. So the pasuk says, the pasuk says, Moshe Rabbeinu implied, it doesn't really say this in the Chumash, but we're trying to read it into Pesukim, that Moshe Rabbeinu said to Aaron, did they bring the Seir Rosh Chodesh where the Kahanim of Elazar and Isamar brought the Seir Rosh Chodesh, and they've disqualified the carbon because they did it as an Einin. So Aaron was truthful. Ein Hikrivu, did they bring the carbon as an Einin, Elazar and Isamar, and they're kohen hedges that disqualify the carbon? Ani Hikrafti, I was the one that brought the Seir Rosh Chodesh. Michlal, from that implies the Inya Akrif, if Elazar and Isamar would have brought the Seir Rosh Chodesh as an Einin, Shapa Itztaruf, then it was very good that it was burned because it was disqualified. So that was Rab Lozer's pasuk. Rab Lozer, my tamala omamin amigdash lo. Why didn't he like this pasuk min amigdash lo that tells you that a kohen gadol is permitted to be makrav oinin? Amalach miksiv ha'achash lo chilul. It's only because you're going like this with your finger and say that only a kohen gadol could be makrav oinin. but a kohen hedyot cannot be makriv. Maybe the Torah is both. A kohen hedyot could be makriv, cannot be makriv, and I would think maybe a kohen gadol could be makriv, could be cannot be makriv. Kamash malon. I'm sorry. It doesn't say it ha'achash lo yotzechila. It doesn't say it that way. Ha'achash lo yotzechila. You have to read it into the pasuk. But maybe ha'achash lo yotze, a kohen hedyot, would also not be mechalal. Okay, so both a kohen hedyot and a kohen gadol would not be mechalal. But from the conversation that Moshe had and Aharon, it would seem to imply that a kohen hedyot that did the avodah would disqualify the carbon. That's why. The idach, why didn't the other Tana learn from Rab Lazar's pasuk? My tamaleheni krivi ksava mipnei tuma nisrafo. He learned that the conversation was nothing to do with aninas. The conversation concerned that Aaron was telling them, the Moshe was saying maybe not because of aninus they did the service, it's because maybe the carbon they were tamei when they brought the Siyar Chodesh, and that's why they burned it. But it was not a conversation about Anina, so therefore you can't bring that as a source for the discussion to prove that an oinen that does this service disqualifies the carbon. The Bay Rabbi Shmuel Tana Rabbi Shmuel says, I have a place where you can tell me that an oinen is disqualified. Asi disqualifies the service. Asi bekal v'chaimim balmum. I'll make a kal v'chaimim balmum. Ma balmum. We go to Ome Beis. She'oichel, he could eat karbanos im avad chilul, but if he does the service, then certainly he disqualifies the carbon, as we said. Oinin, there's a pasuk that says that. Oinin she'ein oichel. Oinin is not allowed to eat kachim. He's not allowed to eat ma'aser sheni, and certainly not allowed to eat kachim. Ein edim shem avad chilul. So therefore, certainly if he did the service, he would disqualify the carbon. Then we go backwards. Ma'ala balmum shkein asaba krevim makrivim. But a balmum is a significant disqualification because it applies to the animal itself. And oinin doesn't apply to the animal. Zar yechich. So then zar will prove, as we said, is zar, we have already a source, that zar disqualifies a carbon. Mal zar kain ein lo takana, but a zar, if you're going to learn directly from a zar can never become better. You can't become a kohen if you're born a non-kohen. So therefore it's disqualifies. But an oinin, left with the passage of time, you're not an oinin anymore. So the Gemara says Bal Yumum Yechiach. But then we see the same idea by Bal Mum. With the passage of time, you could heal yourself from your handicap. And so that can disappear too. So we see that's not the chumrah that disqualifies the carbon. The bottom line between Bal Mum and Zar is Shehin Muzarim. There is a lav telling you that they shouldn't do the service. Vim avdu, if they did the service, chilalu, they disqualified the service. Afani avi, so also I'm going to say in oinim shemuzhar. There's an azara. The Torah says don't do the service when you're in oinim. Vim avad, but if you do the service when you're in oinim chilul, you disqualified the carbon. Says the Gemara, heichen muzhar. Where did the Torah say that a kohen that's an oin should not do the service? Maybe you're going to use the pasuk that tells you that if the kohen gadol does the service, he doesn't disqualify, and you're saying it implies that a regular kohen would disqualify. So chila begufa ksiba. What do I need the kal v'chaima for? It says an oinen could disqualify a carbon. Ella mehein hikrivi v'ksavnenius. It's from that pasuk that says that the Moshe thought that the reason why they burnt the carbon is because of aninas, but there it only says that it's you shouldn't have done it with aninas. It doesn't say that the carbon would become pasul. So therefore, we have a kal v'chomer that says no, that the carbon would become pasul. Says the Gemara, Ika lemifrach. But I could ask you a question. So you're learning it from that you're learning oinain from zar and balmum, right? Zar and balmum. So the Gemara says, that a zar and balmum, there's no exceptions. There's never an exception where a non-Kohen could do the service or a Balmum could do the service. So that's why they disqualify a carbon. So the Gemara says, but there is an exception by an Oinen. A Kohen Gadol could do the service when he's an Oinen. The Gemara says, Tame Yechich. So I'm going to add a third into the equation. Tame can prove it. At Tame, we know that if the carbon Sibar, if everybody in Klal Yisrael is Tame, then you could do the service when you're Tame. So that became, that's Shleihutra Makloi is not in the question anymore. But if you can learn directly from Tame and not add anything else into the equation, Mala Tame became a Tame. But a Tame can make other people Tame. So Hanach Yechichus, and then you'll bring the other two into the equation. Balmum and Zaras. So you're going to learn it from three places: Balmum, Zaris, and Tame. That will teach you that an oinin that does the service disqualifies the carbon. Says the Gemara of Elifrech, let's ask the question: Malatzad Shavish Behem Shkein Hutru Miklolan Eitz and Koyin Gadol Bekarbon Yochid. I'll ask a question. The Tzad Shavish Behem, the common denominator of that is that there's no exception, even by a Koyin Gadol, by a carbon Yochid, right? If it's a private service, a Kohen Gadol, there's no exception. He can't do betuma. He can't, and if it's a balmum, he can't do. And if a non-Kohen can't, there's no exception. So, but Sigmara says, Shem tumami ishtrei, but a Kohen Gadol could do the service if there's a Tomei B'tzibar. So that clears the whole field over here, that you could learn Oinin from Zaris, Balmum, and Tomei, and if an Oinin does the service, he's disqualified. He disqualifies the carbon. And then one last source. Again, how do I know that an Oinin that does the service disqualifies the carbon? So the Gemara says, Ramashashia says, Ase Bakal B'chayim Yoshev. I learned from Bakal B'chayim from somebody that's sitting. Ma Yoshev Shaychel. Someone who's sitting could eat carbonis. But if he did the service, he disqualified the carbon. Oinin Shein Oichel. An Oinin is not permitted to eat any of the carbonis. Certainly, if he did the service, he would disqualify the carbon. Or Mal Yoshev came postulated. You can ask a question. Yoshev is disqualified from saying testimony. That's why it disqualifies a carbon. Yoshev Talmud Chacham. We see that a Talmud Chacham could sit when he's saying Edus, so that's not a question against Yoshev. But Mal Shem Yoshev came possibly Edus. Shem Yoshev loy parach. That's not a question. Just because you find that most people could sit when they say Edus, that is not going to be a question. The imtim saloy parach. If you want to say that's a question, that most people have to that say Edus when they're sitting disqualifies the Edus. So Yoshev is a very harsh thing, and that's why if you sit when you're doing the service of the carbon, you disqualify the carbon. How would that apply to Aninis? Asyam Yoshev mechada mahanach. Then I'm going to bring into the equation one of the others. You take Yoshev as one, and either you bring Zaras or Balmum or Tuma, and you say with these two, I could see that they're not supposed to do the service, and if they do the service, they disqualify the carbon. I'm going to also say in Oinin that if it does the service, you're not supposed to do the service, and if it did the service, the Kohen did the service when he's an Oinin, he would disqualify the carbon. And how do you know the Oinin is not allowed to do the service? Because that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was telling Aaron. Did this carbon become? Did they do the service when they were Oinin, and they were not supposed to do it? So we see there's a Hazara that the Torah tells you that a regular Kohen should not do the service when he is a Oinin. Okay, we'll continue with this topic, Bez Hashem, tomorrow.